Wing Commander Victor Goddard couldn't believe what he was seeing. The first time he flew over Drem Airfield in Scotland, it had been a ruin, with waist-high grass, roofs falling in, and even cattle wandering around where the planes once stood. The next day he flew over, it was strangely alive. Fresh tarmac gleamed in the sun, bright yellow aircraft lined the runway, and a sleek monoplane sat waiting, one he'd never seen before. And then suddenly the light shifted, the scene dissolved, and the airfield was gone. 4 years later, when Drem reopened, it looked exactly as he'd seen it in that impossible moment. He'd seen into the future. In this episode, come with me as we explore what really happened during that flight, what later appeared to match reality, what remains unexplained, and how it connects to two other strange events that would shadow Goddard for the rest of his life. So who was this man who claimed to have seen the future? Victor Goddard wasn't a dreamer or a storyteller. He was a career officer, disciplined, decorated, and deeply respected within the Royal Air Force. Born in 1897, he served in the First World War, flown reconnaissance over the Western Front, and climbed the ranks through technical skill and calm command. By 1935, he was wing commander of the RAF's training command, not the sort of pilot likely to mistake imagination for reality. Those who knew him described him as precise, almost cautious. He studied engineering at Jesus College, Cambridge, and later at the Imperial College, London. He wrote detailed reports on flight safety and went on to become an air marshal, one of the highest ranks in the service. That's what makes what happened next so difficult to explain. Because Goddard's flight that day wasn't meant to be mysterious at all. It was a simple navigation exercise from Andover to Edinburgh, routine by the book, the sort of trip he'd done 100 times before. But somewhere over East Lothian, between the clouds and the coast, something shifted. By the time Goddard had reached East Lothian that day, the weather had started to turn. The clouds sank lower, the horizon blurred, and the wind began to drag at the wings of his biplane. Ahead lay Drem Airfield, a familiar landmark east of Edinburgh, and from the air it looked every bit as neglected as the reports had said. Originally opened in 1916 as West Fenton Aerodrome, Drem had been active during the Great War, but when the fighting ended, the airfield was abandoned. For nearly 2 decades, it sat empty, with hangars rusting and roofs sagging, and the landing ground swallowed by grass. Farmers grazed cattle across the runways. Locals called it a ghost station. So he made a quick note of its position and banked north, continuing towards Edinburgh. The instruments trembled as the turbulence hit. The light dimmed to a dull ochre, the colour of old brass, and rain began to streak across the windscreen. He pressed on towards the coast, a man alone with the sound of his engine, and behind him, Drem slipped away into the mist. But that image of the ruined airfield would not last, because when he passed the same spot again on the return flight, the field below him would be transformed. The next day, heading south on the return leg of his trip, the weather closed in again. The sky turned the colour of brass, and the first drops of rain struck the wings like shot. Goddard tightened his harness and climbed, but the storm built faster than he could rise. The clouds swallowed him whole. For a moment, there was no up or down, only the sound of the engine and the weight of the wind. Lightning flared somewhere beyond the nose of the plane, and the rain thickened to a sheet. His compass spun uselessly. The instruments danced. He banked instinctively, searching for open air, and then, without warning, the light changed. It was as if the storm had torn open. The cockpit filled with gold. The air had cleared, and below the landscape gleamed as though washed clean by the sun. There was Drem again, only now it wasn't the ruined field he'd left behind. The runways were sharp and bright. The hangars stood whole, freshly painted, their roofs catching the light. The grass was rolled flat, perfect and new. Yellow aircraft lined the field, each gleaming in the sun. Ground crew in blue overalls moved between them. At the centre of the field sat a single monoplane, low-winged, sleek and unfamiliar to Goddard, a design he didn't recognise from any planes in the RAF service at the time. He circled once, stunned, heart pounding against the flight straps. The RAF were efficient, but not even they could have rebuilt an entire airfield in the time it took him to fly to Edinburgh and back. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the vision dissolved. The light collapsed into darkness. The storm rushed back in, and Drem was gone. When Goddard finally landed, he said nothing. He was tired, soaked through and unsettled. What he'd seen over Drem didn't fit any rule of flight or weather, and in the Royal Air Force of the 1930s, that was the sort of story best kept to yourself. Among military pilots, talk of anything unusual in the air came with a quiet stigma. A man who reported lights, shapes, or impossible visions could risk being labelled unreliable, even unfit. Careers could end that way, so Goddard kept his mouth shut. He logged the flight as routine. Andover to Edinburgh. Heavy turbulence, storm encountered, nothing more. But the images wouldn't fade. For a man trained to trust instruments and evidence, it was impossible to reconcile. 4 years passed before Victor Goddard thought seriously again about what he'd seen. The storm and the strange airfield had by then become one of those half-buried memories that soldiers learn to file away, too odd to dwell on, too personal to share. Then, in 1939, Drem came back to life. The Royal Air Force reopened it as a training station, complete with new hangars, fresh runways, and the latest generation of aircraft. When it reopened, Goddard later reported that he was in shock when he saw the station, just as he had in 1935. The hangars bright and newly built, grass trimmed, the markings fresh, the rows of yellow trainers on the apron. The ground crews wore blue overalls, and among them stood the new Airspeed Oxford, used for advanced training. He said it was like stepping back into the sunlight of that impossible day. He realised the details he'd once dismissed. The colours, the aircraft, the amount of activity hadn't just been his imagination. They'd simply been waiting 4 years ahead of him. It was then and only then that the full strangeness of what had happened struck him. He'd seen Drem as it would become. In the years that followed, the story of Victor Goddard's flight began to circulate quietly within the RAF. Pilots told it over drinks, half believing, half dismissing, as one of those things that happened to someone else. But when Goddard finally spoke publicly about it, the question was unavoidable. What had really happened that day? To some people, it was a classic time slip, a moment where the past and future seemed to brush against each other. The idea isn't new. From phantom battlefields to the streets of Versailles, there are scattered stories of people stepping briefly into another time. And if you've watched some of my earlier episodes, including the Roman soldiers of York, you'll know this is a pattern that appears again and again. Time slip theory imagines that certain places, often those charged with emotion or change, can momentarily replay or reveal other points in time. A kind of echo, looping through the same coordinates, but out of step with the present. For believers, the violent weather might even have been the key to it. A storm charged enough to twist perception or perhaps even to bend reality itself. It's important to note that Goddard himself never claimed certainty. He never presented his experience as proof of anything supernatural. Instead, he treated it as a puzzle, an event he couldn't explain, but also couldn't deny. But of course, others have tried. A meteorologist might point to disorientation, light refraction, or the glare that sometimes follows a storm like that, enough to make a familiar landscape look new. Psychologists have offered something simpler still, memory reconstruction. By 1939, when Drem really did look as he described, it's possible Goddard's mind joined the two scenes together, the earlier flight and the later airfield, and filled in the gaps between them. Others have even suggested a more practical answer, that he may have just mistaken another airfield for Drem altogether. But the records don't support it. In 1935, Drem was genuinely inactive, and the nearest operational bases, Turnhouse and Lucas, were many miles away and didn't even match the position or the layout he described. Even if the storm had thrown his bearings, colour and the aircraft types he reported simply weren't in use at those stations at the time. So while confusion is possible, it doesn't quite fit. And that leaves his story balanced as ever between the rational and the impossible. Even in later life, he left the question open. He believed human perception might stretch further than we understand, that consciousness under pressure might briefly slip the limits of time. For him, it wasn't proof of the paranormal, but a reminder of how little we know about the connection between the mind, matter, and what lies between. But his story gets even more interesting. The flight over Drem wasn't the only unexplained event connected to Victor Goddard. Years before that storm, another story had already begun, one that would follow him for the rest of his life. In 1919, at the end of the First World War, Goddard was serving with his squadron at a Royal Navy air station known as HMS Daedalus. The men had gathered for a group photo to mark their demobilisation, rows of mechanics and pilots in uniform, the war finally behind them. When the print came back, someone noticed an extra face. Behind one of the airmen, half faded but clear enough to recognise, was a man they all knew well. Freddy Jackson, an aircraft mechanic who'd been killed only days earlier in a propeller accident. Every man in the squadron had attended his funeral. Yet there he was, smiling faintly from the back row. And the man that Freddy was standing behind was Goddard. Decades later, Goddard confirmed the story and identified the photograph in interviews and in his 1975 book, Flight Towards Reality. He said the picture was genuine and that Jackson's death was a matter of record. He offered no theory, only the observation that some things simply do not fit our present understanding of time and presence. This photograph has since become one of the most circulated ghost images in the world, analysed, argued over, and dismissed by skeptics as a double exposure. But the original negative has never been recovered, and no one has found proof of trickery either. And that wasn't the last time something paranormal seemed to brush against Goddard's life. Years later, while stationed in Shanghai, he attended a party held in his honour. Among the guests was Captain Gerald Gladstone of the HMS Black Prince, who began describing a dream he'd recently had. In it, Goddard had died in an aircraft crash over the Asian coast, brought down by icing. As he told the story, Goddard laughed and interrupted. "I'm not quite dead yet. What made you think I was?" Not long afterwards, flying over the Japan Sea, Goddard's aircraft was forced down by heavy icing and crashed on Sado Island. He and his passengers survived. Whether this was coincidence or something stranger, it added one more puzzle to a life already marked by them, a pattern that seemed to follow him from the airfields of Scotland to the skies of Asia. Goddard's stories didn't just fade into the margins of military history either. They found a second life in popular culture, echoing decades later in the Twilight Zone episode The Last Flight. In it, a World War I pilot flies through a storm cloud and lands in the future, a clear reflection of Goddard's strange encounter over Drem. The details obviously were fictionalised, but the idea was the same: a man of reason confronting something that reason just can't explain. Today, Drem Airfield in Scotland is a quiet patchwork of farmland and tarmac. The runways are still visible from above, though the wind now moves through fields instead of hangars. The ghosts of its past are harder to see, but it's not difficult to imagine the moment Victor Goddard described. The sunlight breaking through storm clouds, a glimpse of the future, gone as quickly as it came. Perhaps it was an illusion, a trick of the light, or simply exhaustion. Or perhaps for a few impossible seconds he really did fly across the boundary between what was and what would be. So let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to read them. And if you've enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, or join as a member to support the channel. I'll see you next time.